Hi, my name is Tina Sikka, and I'm going to be presenting a talk that speaks to the exhibit and some of the work that the museum has been doing. The title of the talk is What to Do About #MeToo, Consent, Autonomy, and Restorative Justice, a case study. And it very much speaks to the painting depicted in the story of Lucretia by Artemisia and the symmetry between the two as it relates to the discussion of rape, sexuality, gender, honor, and agency. So the subject of sexual assault and the precarity of consent as it relates to the subjects of race, gender, class, and power, as well as justice, is a matter of really significant consequence to contemporary society. And this is reflected in the thousands of journals and books and journalistic and social media output covering Me Too that's been produced over the past 4 years, which has resulted in academics and journalists holding very polarized views about Me Too's efficacy, its impact, its fairness, and its representativeness. And also its meaning, both for survivors and offenders. Wading into this debate is really kind of dangerous in terms of people who are studying it, in terms of the likelihood of backlash, as well as the reader for whom a very visceral impact of discussions around sexual assault might feel really triggering, and also their experience might feel removed from debates in academia around consent and sexual relationality and criminal justice. So my journey with respect to this project that I put together really had to do with an uneasiness I felt around how consent as a legal theory was being constructed, and how it developed historically. A lot of people don't know was consent comes out of conceptions of contract and property, and how it was being deployed around Me Too, as well as in current discussions around feminism and sexual assault. So you couple that with an underlying carceral or punitive feminism, and it drew me to ask the question, which is kind of my research question, of whether it was possible for contemporary conceptions of affirmative and enthusiastic consent to exist alongside sex positive feminism, so the two of those, and also embracing restorative justice over incarceration. So it's kind of looking at how those three elements might exist together and actually help each other. So when I was reading and watching and monitoring a lot of the articles and the books and video clips, Twitter debates, and Facebook updates, and it brought me to some interesting conclusions. Yet I felt that there was a kind of hashing out that needed to occur, that there were all these static conversations happening in academia that weren't working together. And so I contacted 5 British-based academics working in the areas of sexuality studies, law, media studies, and sociology, to get a sense of their understanding and attitudes around where the research stands and where the public debate stands. So it was an interdisciplinary research study of sorts, aimed at eliciting conclusions and insights about whether there was a model of sexual relationality that is co-determined, pleasure-driven, perhaps consent-based, and embodied, and whether a model like that could exist around a progressive model of criminal justice, one that hinges on prison abolition and restorative justice and police abolition, which we see a lot now with the Black Lives Movement. So in asking what the participants, this is sort of what I came out with in terms of talking to these subjects and getting a sense of what they thought. There were some conclusions I think are really interesting, and I wanted to share them to a broader audience. And I think in light of this, this exhibit is really fits well. So asking what the participants thought about how consent as an ideal model of sexual relations in the context of Me Too, how it developed. And I wanted to get their thoughts on consent and the status of consent and consider arguments for and against it, and which I would ask you to do as well. And for the purposes of the project, in a way of providing context, I began by talking about the history of consent, as well as its more recent developments into affirmative or enthusiastic consent, that sort of yes means yes model, that's made really popular in universities in particular. So I asked whether the fact that consent is actually rooted in a property model, wherein it was thought that one can sort of bargain over their physical personhood in a contractual agreement, is flawed. So there's that association of early models of consent with women as property that can be given by the father to the husband, and of rape as a property crime, which it traditionally was linked to this idea of consent as contract, and whether that sort of tainted the way consent worked now. So a lot of the participants, most of them, were critical of consent, the way that it has been used in English language media around Me Too. They thought that its property roots had led to an erasure of female sexuality and desire, that was perpetuating unequal power relations, where it's sort of the woman gives consent and the man takes it, so the woman is seen as passive. This asymmetry is not really accounted for in our legal environment, but it constitutes most sexual interactions. Also dealt with in the interviews is how the property model is really liberal, in the sense that it assumes that a person is, constituted by the exercise of free will and popular sovereignty, but it really doesn't look at how people are oppressed in different ways, and that there are norms that are racist and ableist and misogynistic that constrain how we can exercise free choice in any circumstance. The participants also highlighted the ways in which liberal models of consent are gendered and raced, that they're often ignore symbolic and class structures that are rooted in colonialism and patriarchal violence. So we don't make choice in a vacuum. A really interesting interchange occurred around the roots of consent as it relates to race and slavery, where under slavery, in the States, Black women were thought to be unable to give consent because of their slave status. Their bodies were seen as sexual property, and Black men were pathologized as less than human and a sexual danger to white women. So in addition to having this very racist legacy, the early models of consent framed some women as need of patriarchal protection. So it is sort of, inherently masculine in this way, and a masculine model of desire. Another critique was that it is very heteronormative. So consent has been used to police non-normative and subversive or queer sexual practices. So gay sex, BDSM, and polyamory push the boundaries of consent and has traditionally been criminalized. One interviewee made the case that consent is undercut by play and excess and risk associated with the nighttime economies. So that pleasure-danger binary makes consent kind of a quaint construct. So things like homonormativity, co-opting queer practices is another layer of complexity. I think one of the beyond traditional models of consent was perhaps we need to think about bodily integrity or sexual autonomy. Sexual autonomy is much more capacious in that it models sexual relations, finding frameworks that foster autonomy and choice. So equal participation, co-determination, erotic flourishing, and everyone agreed with the basic definition that sexual autonomy of being able to co-determine what is about to happen as for realizing sexual choice was, an ideal, that it looked like an optimal model. One of the good things about sexual autonomy is that it makes the force requirement immaterial. So the question of whether there's been an assault is whether the interaction fosters sexual autonomy or not. So was decision-making constrained in some way? Autonomy, though, has its own set of problems. It doesn't have a kind of clear mechanism for legal translation. You would have to foster a lot of cultural change. One interviewee in particular pointed out that sexual autonomy might not challenge the liberal model of individual decision-making. So it's like this idea we're all free to make free decisions. And that's particularly the case if autonomy is just about making a choice. It doesn't look at power disparities, material inequalities, relational dynamics, norms. None of those are considered. Models of sexual autonomy have also been criticized as downplaying culture and social structure that might constrain equal participation. On affirmative consent, one interviewee stated that it ignores the fact that sex can be undesired but consented to, which is really interesting in the context of a marriage or a committed relationship or for purposes of pregnancy. It also reproduces the mind-body split. It's this idea that we can make rational choice and everything that matters is in our brains, that we're disembodied in some way. Lacey has a really interesting model of sexual integrity. So you need to have the bodily and affective aspects of sexual life as part of it. Aya Gruber summarizes this and builds on a critique of affirmative and enthusiastic consent she sort of argues that sexual autonomy doesn't go far enough, that what we tend to be doing is to just reform affirmative consent in little ways, and that is not particularly optimal. So after this kind of discussion we had, we were like, okay, what other options are there? And we talked about, the inarticulateness of sex, the ways in which desire often pushes up against legal boundaries, which is why it makes Me Too so difficult, because we're trying to put a very sort of messy practice into a legal box. And how can we do this? That desire is important. So we looked at queering consent. So queering is a verb that's used to talk about destabilizing and interrogating and challenging boundaries, and that would include heteronormative sex and consent. But that sometimes queering has been popularized and been used to just mean question and mildly question, but it could be used as a tactic. Relations of power were discussed, as well as Me Too particularly, and they were worried that some of the discussions around risk and pleasure and desire and power were being elided in contemporary discussions around consent and sexuality for Me Too. So they were worried that specific cases, including that of Harvey Weinstein and Cosby and Aziz Ansari and Jian Ghomeshi, were discussed in very general terms And there were concerns expressed around the Aziz Ansari case. And that case sparked a lot of controversy. And it was generally agreed by everyone that it was an example of how gender roles and class difference and heteronormativity and hegemonic masculinity and confusion around consent had conspired to create conditions under which a comedian, a very famous one, was felt as though it was permissible to push his date into engaging into sexual activities she felt she had made clear verbally and non-verbally that she was not comfortable with. Monica Lewinsky was brought up in the context of Me Too as a limit case in which sort of feminist agency, power, and capital and structures of inequality clashed. A number of years ago, when the whole Lewinsky-Clinton relationship was made public, she was very clear that despite their age difference and status difference, that she, it was consensual. But upon reflecting, there's now this argument of, was it consensual? Can you consent when there's such a disparity in relations of power and fame factor? And it was worried that the hashtagness of Me Too was perhaps commodifying a social movement. And there was a worry that the fame factor was marginalizing the experience of poor and racialized women whose concrete experiences of harassment and assault were being ignored. Who Me Too represents was a frequent refrain. While the role of technology, and particularly social media, was brought up as a tool that could serve as a means of activism and catharsis, which is what Me Too is really doing, and a dangerous site of harassment. The other part of the interview was on restorative justice. So we didn't really come to a conclusion on an alternative model of sexual relations. We were sort of hashing out all these different options, problematizing consent, thinking about how it fits into the Me Too movement. I'm doing more research and writing a book on that now, so maybe some more hard and fast conclusions can come out. But we also talked about restorative justice. And we were thinking about how contemporary moves towards prison abolition and restorative justice and decarceration fit with Me Too. And that you would think that a progressive social movement that, for example, is supportive of the goals of Black Lives Matter, of which restorative justice is a key plank, how it could sort of reconcile itself with the carceral feminism. So carceral feminism came to the fore after second wave concerns with gender inequality and a distrust of the state. And it really gave way to an embrace of criminal law and things like mandatory minimums for sex offenders in the 1980s. Feminism in the late 90s and 2000s provided more space for feminist criticisms of the prison industrial complex and the efficacy of punitive law, whether it was fostering any kind of cultural change, and that the people who were suffering from a lot of these more harsh laws were racial minorities and also queer men a lot of the time. And there was this desire for Me Too to be more inclusive. And it would seem like decarceration and prison abolition would be an obvious fit. And so I asked interviewees what they thought about this disjuncture within Me Too. And most participants agreed that the contradiction was odd because Me Too is a social justice movement, and like most contemporary social justice movements, you'd think would veer away from prisons and incarceration as a solution. And this sort of echoes the thesis about a desire to strengthen criminal legislation and investment in policies and practices led by the police and prosecutors and courts. And sort of why has this been the case? And so attention was paid to whether restorative justice options were feasible and desirable, whether they fit with the goals of Me Too. And restorative justice, Zare argues, addresses more the roles and kind of the kind of the responsibilities of offenders, and looking at how victims of crime and offenders in communities could hold people responsible in relation to violations of law. And so the victim, it's argued, needs to have involvement and empowerment within the justice process. So healing is a central plank of restorative justice, the telling of their story. The offender needs to empathize with the victim, take responsibility, to acknowledge that they committed the crime. The community is involved as a secondary victim and is encouraged to have their voices heard as well. It's about healthier communities. And so it is really about centering the survivor's needs, the requirement that responsibility is taken by the perpetrator. It has to be collaborative, so a plan is developed to address the harm, and you can have restitution and community service and education and reparation. And it's about repairing harms against the survivor and the community, rather than having the state as part of this. Some were not really familiar with a lot of the principles of restorative justice. It's been used in Canada and the US and Australia, including mediation. There's community reparative boards, family group conferencing, circle sentencing. A lot of the interviewees were enthusiastic about the potential for restorative justice to work as an alternative. And there's a lot of studies that are out there that there are high rates of satisfaction, less fear on the part of survivors, less recidivism. Indigenous peacemaking circles used in Canada had been successful in dealing with gender-based violence. That was seen as persuasive. And these, interestingly, are really rooted in Indigenous practices out of Australia, New Zealand, Canada. A notable example is Restore, which is the Responsibility and Equity for Sexual Transgressions, offering a restorative experience program, which occurred in Arizona. So interviewees noted that restorative justice might allow for complexity and provide scope to do things differently, particularly given the rates at which the current legal system had failed. An interesting line was taken by one of the people I interviewed with respect to how restorative justice might provide a way for power to work differently, encourage new perspectives and alternative forms of justice. But there was also a concern that, if it was really a viable alternative, there would need to be fundamental change from retribution to healing. Queer justice was brought up as in line with the objectives of restorative justice and feminist practice, reimagining and renegotiating principles of justice. When I started to talk about whether the criticisms of such approaches, in terms of their being considered, that we would need to really have a lot of more empirical evidence of restorative justice working. There's the worry that survivors could be pressured by the community to reconcile, and how the definition of traditional justice had been misrepresented or romanticized, and also concerns around the safety of survivors, and that maybe the community wouldn't hold perpetrators accountable. The need for empirical evidence became a really key theme in these conversations, as was whether restorative justice could deal with disparities of power and post-process accountability. Does it do well with memory and rape trauma? I mean, criminal justice doesn't help with that either. There are so many problems with criminal justice, which has just been really egregious with dealing with gender-based violence. And a lack of cohesive communities or publics through which to hold perpetrators accountable. The need for law as a point of departure, that maybe we need it to set boundaries, sort of traditional law, expectations and systems of accountability was discussed. And then we returned to Me Too to think about how this might fit overall with the Me Too movement. There's consensus that restorative justice was desirable and necessary and something to strive for, but that the logistics and practicalities and legal changes were really difficult. An observation was made by one of the interviewees who noted that the grayness of many of the Me Too cases could be perhaps ideal for restorative justice to be put into practice, because there would be a kind of conversation. This might be useful not only in creating conditions for justice to be realized, but also for mitigating fears of trial by media, and also the vagaries of cancel culture. Nora Stewart sort of talks about how it could be a way to extend the impact of Me Too, and to find a way for victims to find resolution, and for offenders to gain insight into their actions and concrete channels through which to restore an earned reputation to move forward. And to reiterate, I went into these interviews with the objective of answering that question. Like, is it possible for contemporary conceptions of consent to fit alongside sex-positive left feminism while also embracing restorative justice over incarceration? And given the conversations I had, the conclusions I came to were that the shortcomings of the liberal model of consent that we have, its rootedness in contract law, its neglect of relations of power, the fact that it's heteronormative, enforces gender passivity, denies women's pleasure, criminalizes race populations, that is insufficient. And I think looking at sexual autonomy, embodied autonomy, sexual integrity, and other such models offered more fruitful ways forward, particularly in light of the attention they pay to embodiedness and human flourishing and desire and communication. But I left each of the conversations with a sense that none of the paradigms that were currently on offer were fit to deal with some of the uniqueness of sex as a embodied, intersubjective, and trust-requiring practice that really exceeds legal strictures and normative boundaries, that it's conditioned by risk, pleasure, desire, the abject, difficult to define social conventions, and discussions of sexual assault, I think, in particular, have to factor all of these into the conversation and into conversations around Me Too, which is really, it's failed to do so far. A similar ambivalence was present amongst the interviewees. As they discussed restorative justice, it was agreed to that the criminal justice system is woefully unfit for purpose. But that perhaps we could set out ideals to strive towards. Some were more enthusiastic about restorative justice. In the end, I came away with the impression that a consensus had been reached as to its importance going forward, and that Me Too, for all its messiness, was seen to call for alternatives like this, since all participants communicated concern and confusion that a social movement that centered social justice would still call for solutions that were carceral. And going forward, I think I came out thinking that it would really behoove scholars, including myself, to really probe the opportunities and potentials opened up by this set of conversations. My own work is really doing this, and I'm writing a book now along these lines, scaling up the interviews, talking more about this in a collaborative way, and that the approach going forward would have to center power, consider the role played by social media and social movements, and still, I feel very strongly that it should present a model of justice that is consistent with restorative rather than punitive ethics. And I think that it's this kind of work that Me Too really has to turn towards and move towards, and do so in a way that is really in pursuit of ideals that we can all agree to.